First of all, I want to start, as I always do, by thanking Shomer and Muda for being the host over here. That's very nice of them. Appreciate it. And the Lehman family up here tonight for sponsoring the series. And tonight's sponsors, as you can see, first of all, the Birnbaums. There's Ken Birnbaum, who's a steady sponsor. We very appreciate it very much. And his parents, I mean, we all lived through this period that we're going to be talking about today. The other one is the Obersteins, as you can see, who's doing it. You probably never heard of the Oberstein family. You probably never know who they are, right? And some of them came from Alabama, as we're about to find out. But seriously, this is being done in memory of one of our Oberstein's relatives. And as a junior historian himself, I'm going to call upon him to say a few words about the person in whose memory half of tonight's lecture is being sponsored. Please, Rabbi Oberstein, come forward.
Over the years, I've written about my uncle many times in the Where, What, When, but I just wanted to pick a couple things. My Uncle Joe was the only Shomer Shabbos Balabos in Montgomery, Alabama. And he didn't come after World War II. He came before World War I. And he remained faithful to that his whole life. And he was a big influence on me, and perhaps the reason I'm here today, the way I am, has a lot to do with the example that he set. And I just want to mention 2 or 3 big, short examples of how he loved Eretz Yisrael. He used to give $5, this is like in the 50s, he used to give $5 to every envelope that came from Eretz Yisrael. And they were very fruitful and multiplied. He had this many, like this. And when I went to Israel to study in Yeshiva Kerem B'Yavneh, I showed it to Rabbi Goldovich, the Rosh Yeshiva, and he said, these places don't exist. The Yisachar Zebulun Institute, which is in a post office box, is just a vehicle for somebody to raise money, to get some money. So when I came back, I told my uncle, he said, with my $5, he's not going to buy a Cadillac, he's going to buy a challah for Shabbos. I want him to have a challah for Shabbos. Many years later, Fegi and I were living in Sharei Chesed neighborhood, and I was going through, and he came like this, and I said, Uncle Joe, the address is next door. He said, don't put a stamp on it. And I took it, and he took it, and he went next door, and he introduced himself. Hi, I'm Oberstein from Alabama. As if they knew him. And he gave him the check. And he came back very happy that he had seen it was actually a poor family with a lot of children, and a woman who looked very poor and didn't have any teeth, and he was very happy that he had given her money. Many years, our shul in Montgomery, like many, many other shuls out of town, became conservative in the 1950s. And Uncle Joe was Orthodox, but he was the only Orthodox. So what could he do about it? He and his wife, Aunt Rose, decided to go to Israel for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and many times for Sukkot also, every year. I'm talking in the mid-1950s when going to Israel was rare. He went to Israel every year, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and often for Sukkot. That was his big... that's what he spent money on. The rest of the year he was very frugal. One time he was walking on the streets in Tel Aviv, and just to pass the time, and he saw a tailor shop. And just to schmooze, to pass time, he went into the tailor shop and asked the guy in Yiddish, are you a good tailor? And the guy pulled up his sleeve and showed him his numbers from the concentration camp, and he said, if I wasn't a good tailor, they wouldn't have kept me alive. Uncle Joe ordered a suit from this man, not once, but many times over the years. He wouldn't buy a suit in Montgomery, but he would have a tailor-made suit in Tel Aviv because that's the Ahavas Yisrael that he had. There's a lot more, but I'll let Rabbi Katz take over.
That's actually very good. These are types that I'm not going to speak in those terms tonight exactly because I'm casting a wide net. As soon as we get to Orthodox Jews in America, especially in the lifetime of many of us, some of you older than myself, so it's more a matter of a certain perspective. So let's make this formal. The name of this series is The Last Years Before Oslo, the State of Israel and the Jewish People 1988 to 1992. Tonight is the 13th lecture out of, I think, 16, called Life After Gedolim, Reflections. Again, Life After Gedolim. Reflections on American Orthodox Judaism in the late 20th century. Before I forget, listen very closely. I'm not going to be here next week. It's a change in the schedule. It's in the new where, when, and when. I send it out. I know no matter what I do, even if I fly over with an airplane, some of you are going to come anyway. But nevertheless, I want to be yotzei my part. I have to be out of town. And so don't tell that to anybody. That's a secret. And so we're just moving everything 1 week forward. You know what I mean, 1 week back. So don't come next week. It'll be 3 more, I believe, after this week. But you know what I mean. 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks now, 4 weeks now, hopefully. And then we'll be done. So keep that in mind. And just tell everybody I won't be here next week, but don't tell them where I'm going to be. Okay, I know my secret is safe with you. Here we go. Tonight we do a historical survey of Orthodox Judaism and Orthodox Jewish culture in America using hindsight to provide what I hope is insight and wisdom. If the title tonight is Life After Gedolim, that means that there was a period in which there were Gedolim. As we shall see, taking the broad view, this is a rather short period in American Jewish history, but an extremely significant one. A period of less than half a century, but which stamped American Orthodox Jewry powerfully and has prevented American Orthodox Jewry, for the most part, in going off in certain directions, as we shall see. In other words, the period of the Gedolim was an episode. It wasn't there, it was there, it wasn't there. Came, went. I'm referring tonight to charisma as that term manifests itself in Orthodox Judaism and culture. This charisma was here for about 4 or 5 decades or so, and then it departed, leaving a vacuum. Has anything filled that vacuum? This is a fascinating question of sociology, is it not? What really turns kids on? What electrifies them? Who electrifies them? Anyone? No one? This is an important chapter in American Jewish history, though I'm not sure so far that historians define it as such, particularly if you're not from. But it is significant in American Jewish history, and time and perspective will make it ever more so, unless I miss my guess. You see, in America, the Orthodox Jews are funny. On the one hand, they're the smallest group. On the other hand, they're the fastest growing. So if you look at the figures there, they're rough figures, and, lies, damn lies, and statistics and so forth. But I would say these are roughly accurate, that at the current time, 12% of American Jews are Orthodox, using the term as broadly, but and I'm not referring to people who are completely not from and just have membership in an Orthodox synagogue, as was once upon a time. I mean Orthodox, from right to left. And nevertheless, almost 20% of the young. So that's very interesting. 12% overall, and 20%, 18% of the young. You know how they play with these figures. I have my own pet peeve about how they do these figures, but whatever. Including Hasidim, of course, right? It's a big part of these large numbers. You can't subtract that. Now, this has been true for some time now. But it wasn't true 100 years ago. What exactly happened? What are the megatrends in the history of American Orthodox Judaism Jewry? I don't believe the story of the history has been written yet. Not successfully, anyway. Now, we all know in the 1800s down until 1914, Orthodox Judaism was always anemic and always hemorrhaging with no solution in sight. It was always just falling apart. That's what it was. The decade of, now I want to give you a sense of historic perspective, and I have to warn you, as I always do 10,000 times, this is my take on it. Okay? This is my take on it. The decade of the First World War, which is 1914 and 1924, in my opinion, that saw the first small steps towards not a revival of Orthodox Judaism in America, a vival. Okay? Some false steps. For example, like the Agudas Rabbanim. They thought at the time, if the rabbis would get together in some organization and they look real impressive with beards and long coats and this and that and the other, and they're able to, learn Gemara and so forth, that will somehow or other turn American Jewry around. That didn't work. That was a big failure. Okay? But this decade also saw some more significant baby steps. And that has to do with the starting of educational institutions. 1914 to 24. That's YU. It's TA. It's Turvadas. It's HTC, that's Skokie as we call it today, Chicago. And a few other, but those are the significant ones. In other words, the first institution of chinuch, such as they were. Dr. Revel started the first high school, and that was the revolution. I don't think people realize that. There was a time when there was no such thing, not only a base merit, but there was no such thing as a high school. Orthodox Jews are too dumb and stupid to be able to organize something as important as a high school. Maybe an elementary school, maybe, but anything beyond that, not. And he said it can be done. As we all know, this happened in the decade of, to be exact, 1915 is when they started, what do you call it today, MTA, I think, and which is now over 100 years old, if you think about it. And that really is a revolution. Now, small steps, the baby steps. And then a few years later, you get that in Turvadas. And my point's like this. You can't imagine anything like an Orthodox Bible without a high school, at least. You don't realize that, okay? And so in other words, the kid, and at that time as a boy, goes from kindergarten to 12th grade. That was beyond. There was a time when you could only kindergarten at the most. This is for the from mist. Kindergarten to 6th, 7th, 8th grade. Okay? TA in Baltimore, for example, until the 1940s, was up to 6th grade. You see? So this is all part of what you call baby steps. Now these were weak beginnings, and they had small enrollments. They had inferior secular education, and the Limudi Kodesh was no great shakes either. This is the great era, where all the teachers spoke Yiddish, and the only thing they knew how to do was hit you over the head with a baseball bat. Going by my personal experience, okay? Although I have to warn you, none of us ever felt traumatized, because everybody got it. You understand? Today, if somebody go like this to a kid, it'd be in a shrink's office for 6 weeks. We got the chairs thrown at us and nothing, okay? So that's that era. They certainly couldn't compete with public schools. And the reason I'm mentioning that is most parents, even from, says, no, I want my kid to get a public school education, right? And yet, in spite of everything, there was progress. Now, again, we're looking back from the perspective of a century. There was progress in the interwar years, but there were small in numbers. In other words, 1924 to 34, let's say the 20s and the 30s in general, did see certain steps carrying it forward from the first decade. There's no question about that, okay? And so we see the beginnings of certain yeshivas starting to take off the ground, certain high schools, as for example, Chicago and Tarvadas, and maybe RJJ, high schools start in the 30s, and Rav Hutner, for example, starts as the principal of the high school in, Chaim Berlin, in 34. I don't think that these details are noticed, but you and I, as I look around over here, you understand what school means, what high school means, what post-high school. These are real things to us, okay? And they're definitely, but they were small and they're very small. Okay, so it's still anemic, but nevertheless pushing in a direction. But they're also very American. First of all, very Litvish, but also in the American reality. So even though you had these people over here, this is Mendelovich, okay? This is Robert Foote. That's the youngest picture I could find of him with his daughter. There's Rabbi Ruderman from yesteryear, okay? And that's this is Skokie, Rabbi Silber, who founded the HTC. You understand? Beis Medrash Torah. And there's Dr. Rebel, of course. And there's probably one or two or three others. As you know, it was in the 20s and 30s that they, quote unquote, made their move. And it wasn't an easy time, but I always emphasize they were Americanized. They had come here before the Second World War. Actually, they had come here before the First World War. All the Jews, without exception, wanted to Americanize in one way or another in those years. And why not? They were the best country in the world, right? When all said and done, it's a gold in a Medina. It really was. No question about it. That doesn't mean they gave you gold when you got off the boat, but nevertheless, compared to the other countries, unbelievable. And so the yeshivas that they were founding were grounded in an American reality. They simply said, yes, you boys growing up will Americanize. That's good, but don't, take the baby with the bathwater. Don't throw out the Yiddishkeit. You get it? So we don't expect you not to get a high school education, a college education, and so forth, or go out and get jobs for the most of you unless you're going to be Klei Kodesh. But keep Shabbos, learn, kashrus, and so forth. Okay? So it's very important to make this a point, which is why all these places had college programs in one fashion or another. YU and Skokie, of course, near Israel, as you know. Torah Vodaas, Chaim Berlin, and all those places, RJJ, all had guys that went in the evening, to see college or something like that. But on the other hand, it was a chiddush that the person said, yes, but he wants to be a Shomer Shabbos. You see? He wants to be a Shomer Torah mitzvahs. Now, it definitely, as I said before, it definitely included college and high school. If you were an exception, you went to study in Europe. There's a handful of boys that go to Lithuania or Poland or someplace like that. But that's very small numbers. And they're going to say, I don't want to go for college. Now, and even them, if you want to be perfectly honest, the majority of them were Americanized. Because I knew them and you knew them. Okay. Now, the schools I'm talking about in the 20s and 30s, movies, newspapers, sports, for sure. You see what I'm saying? The point was to create at least a tiny nucleus, or at least this is what happened. They created a tiny nucleus of American-born from population, at least for boys. Okay? This was the first wave. The goal, as I see it, though no one formally articulated that way and thought about it this way, was to imitate the Catholics. You want a situation in which you have kindergarten, as I say, through Notre Dame, through Fordham. At the period I'm talking about, they didn't progress to the point of setting up colleges everywhere and then postgraduate, all the rest of it. If you ask Dr. Revel, for example, or something like that, or even others, the goal will be you get a boy that can go all the way to medical school and still be within Yiddishkeit. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? Like that. Okay. Now, notice you have grad school with the Limudei Kodesh under from auspices. In my opinion, the only real difference within this subculture, talking about again the 20s and 30s, was the famous question, which is a completely theoretical question: do you want Torah Mata or Torah Parnasa, as we frame it today? So Dr. Revel, for example, articulated this idea of synthesis and all the rest of it, which never was ever implemented. You can see many memoirs of boys who went to YU in 1920s. They said, we heard about it, we never saw it, because you can't really do it. There's no such thing, as far as I can understand, of a from biology. You get it? A from chemistry. What is that? You understand? Nevertheless, the notion was, it sounded good, that they wouldn't articulate, a Torah Mata idea, which is, you're successfully integrated both, as opposed to the other way, which would be Torah Vodaas, and the other place in Israel, which is the Torah Parnasa, meaning you got to make a living, so the guy does become a doctor, but you don't attach any particular value to it. The main thing is the learning, is the frumkeit. But at the end of the day, these are theoretical differences. Now, you understand what I'm saying. In other words, YU or Turo, to use modern terminology, which is what's become. Kids who go and just, especially online courses, this, that, and the other, get to graduate school in order to get they're not looking to integrate nothing. They want to make a living. Now, keep in mind, none of the leaders that I just pointed to you before were Gedolim. Not Dr. Revel, not Rabbi Ruderman in the 1930s, not Shragafai Mendelovich, or anywhere. Hutner in the 1930s, none of these people. The Gedolim lived in Europe. see at that time. The Gedolim were people like this. You understand? Back in countries like Poland, Lithuania, perhaps Hungary, things like those are the Gedolim. You understand? So America didn't have these central figures within the Frum culture. I want to be very clear about this. Then, of course, came the Second World War and its aftermath. And in that time came the second wave. And then the Gedolei Ador moved physically to America. That's the point I'm trying to make tonight. Okay? So when you get to people like you see on the picture here, these were biggies in Europe. They didn't become important people over here. The Satmar was a big deal in Europe. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, you don't need me to tell you, was a big deal in Europe. A Gadol Ador. Rabbi Aharon Kotler was a big Gadol Ador in Europe, way before America. So in other words, the leading religious figures, or some of the leading religious figures of Orthodox Jewry, period, came to these shores, which is something that never happened before. And that's what I mean when I'm talking about before Gedolim, during Gedolim, and after Gedolim. As we know, prior to the Second World War, these people and people like them had viewed America as a backwater. But as we all know, the Holocaust changed that. These Gedolei Ador came here with a different attitude towards Americanism and Americanization than the Mechanchim and Rosh Hashivas that I showed you previously. This is a new wave with a new attitude, different than what was there in the 20s and 30s. Once here, each one of these famous people and people like them undertook, listen closely, undertook not to adopt to America, but rather to do everything to transplant European culture over here, European Jewish culture, as much as was possible. In other words, they brought a principled rejection of American culture. Now, I don't mean political culture, because the next one, I think they were all in favor of the Constitution of the United States. I'm being very serious, right? The political freedom, yeah, that's good. And that makes America a golden and Medina and so forth and so on. But everything else, right, is bad. Now, that's not what you had here before, but it is what you start to get here in the 1940s. And it's articulated very directly, and perhaps even ideologically, and this is new. It wasn't here before. Once here, each one of these three, and I only picked three of the prominent ones, you can only fit so many on a screen. Once here, each one in his way undertook not to adapt to America. But I'm talking about a rejection, in other words, of American popular culture, a rejection of American fashions, of American values, other than the Constitution, even of the American language. They spoke Yiddish as much as possible, English as little as possible, and they encouraged their followers to do the same. And this still goes on, okay? To the degree they can pull it off, right? The yeshivas haven't been successful with that. The Satmar are still pretty doggone successful with that, as we know. So that's really a pretty stark, see what I just did? A pretty stark rejection of American culture. Okay. The earlier generation, as I told you, had said, as you Americanize, don't throw out Judaism with the baby bathwater. The new generation here said, don't Americanize, period. I'll say it again. The old generation says, as you Americanize, keep the Yiddishkeit. The new generation says, what do you mean, as you Americanize? Don't Americanize. Most significantly, I would say, the new generation carried with them the message of a principled rejection of college, of secular culture as such. This was new in American Orthodoxy. Interestingly, there was not a rejection of secondary education, of high school. I've always wondered about this. I think there are historical reasons for that, because you could be doggone sure if you asked the Satmar Rebbe, or even the Lubavitcher Rebbe or Rabbi Aharon Kotler, people like that, if you could do away with the high school, would you do so? They would probably say yes. I mean, I'm sure they would, but I don't think that was even open for negotiation. There was American parents that time, that's already beyond. Okay? But I'm not sure. Somebody could do a nice dissertation on that question. Let me concentrate now on the yeshiva world for a moment, because I think that's most relevant for us here tonight, before I move on. And here, of course, the key figure, as we said, was Rabbi Aharon Kotler. He brought an unprecedented yeshivish charisma. I'll say it again, it was unprecedented. No one had that kind of authority and charisma before he showed up. He was a European Rosh Yeshiva, so he'd been a big shot over there. He had been one of the biggest over there, I would say. And so he was acknowledged as being bigger in learning than anyone over here. That's a yeshiva expression, you're bigger in learning. That alone endowed him with an aura, and that alone was a kind of charisma. It's the charisma of the real thing. You know, this guy dresses this way, and that guy's got a little bit of color. He's the real thing. Especially when you add that he had a saintly personality. In addition, notice he wasn't a phony. In addition, he had the personality of a born leader. He had a clear direction, an ideal, and he was full of energy and dynamism in the pursuit of the ideal, and he willingly assumed a hands-on leadership in every area he could, particularly in connection with Jewish education, but also in every other area of Jewish life that he could. You never had anybody like this before over here. I'll be clear, right? The others are, so to speak, pygmies compared to this, and weak and anemic compared to all this. Indeed, Rabbi Aharon Kotler energized, and he came here in 41, he energized a move to create day schools everywhere, and he himself poskined all the Torah Maseret questions. So one of the big social revolutions in this country was the 40s and the 50s, when hundreds of day schools were started across this country. Again, this is something that's never been written up properly in the history books. It's just kind of interesting. American Jewry was rather late in the day. It's the 1940s. Okay, public school was really in everywhere, and we're talking about going, across the country from the East Coast to the West Coast. Some of us still remember Dr. Joe Kamenetsky and those kinds of things, going every week, every month to another town, and you got to persuade and he found people in Tennessee and Texas and California and Minneapolis, all over the crazy place. Now, how come this wasn't there before? So you had this dynamo over here, you see? And he says, I'm backed up by Rabbi Aharon Kotler, which he was, who, by the way, did give him the backing. So sometimes, they say, should we have a co-ed school? Should we have not school? Should we allow this, allow this? He said, I'm just asking Rabbi Aharon Kotler, And if he says it, that's it, and that's how it went. So in other words, what I'm talking about is a revolution for Orthodoxy, which had not done this before the war, set up schools, because it lacked, clearly, Rabbi Aharon Kotler's spark plug leadership. And Rabbi Aharon Kotler did not mind taking up positions different from those who had been in America until now. 3 examples come to mind. First of all, he killed Touro College. What do I mean when I say that? I'm using language that you'll understand. In the 40s, the people are already here. I'm talking about Rosh Raghav Mendelovich. I'm talking about Rav Hutner. So these are from guys. Even Victor Miller was part of this. They wanted to set up what you and I would call a Touro College. This is a famous incident. It's in the New York State records. And in other words, they didn't want YU. God forbid, a Zionist and Torah Mata and all this stuff. God forbid. But on the other hand, they said, we don't want the boys to go to City College, to Brooklyn College, that's not the other. We can make it. So let's do what you and I today call a Touro College. So it'll be just there for Parnassa, so to speak, with no ideology. And they got it incorporated, and this, and that, and the other. This is in 47. And again, if you Google online, you can find it. And you see the people signing, Rav Hutner and this one, that, and the other, all these names. And it never happened, because Rabbi Aharon Kotler killed it. You see? Now, obviously, he said like this: we want in America, to be no college, and even if some people will cheat and all that, but the message has to be no college. So in other words, that's the case of somebody coming and asserting a very strong leadership. You may agree with it, you may disagree. That's not my point at all. That doesn't matter. Who cares what you think? I'm talking about what he did, and he was able to pull it off because he was who he was. The second example, which is probably more famous to you, is he got all the Rosh Yeshivas together in 1956 to say that you can't join an organization as a reform and conservative. Right? He got everybody except Rav Soloveitchik. And who's he to do that? Who are you to tell OU what to do and all that? It worked. No, let's put it this way. It began, definitely, as we know, a major trend in which this just doesn't happen. All those councils of yesteryear, you know, in Baltimore, Maryland, not really. There's a lot of Rabbanim on one hand, the Baltimore Council of Rabbis, or whatever they call it, on the other. And really, take it from me, they don't meet, okay? That's how it's two different worlds. So this was not the way it wasn't before then. There were many prominent Orthodox rabbis in this country who were members of the Joint Council in one capacity or another. I mean, Rabbi Leo Young comes to mind, for example, people like that. And he killed it, okay? As a personal assertion, a leadership thing. And thirdly, the thing that comes to mind is he basically, I would say, established the idea of kollel, which is the most un-American institution that you can imagine. It's the most un-American and countercultural institution that I can conceive of, okay? First of all, it's the antithesis of college. And second of all, it's the antithesis of Americanism. These were markers. No, he was setting out markers. Because of his dynamic personality, because he radiated authority, his positions were adopted as the legitimate from positions. Believe me, we're in Baltimore, Maryland. Near Israel had a hard time in the time of Aharon Kotler. He was friends with Rabbi Rudim. That's Rabbi Rudim and that's Aharon Kotler. They're even related somehow. But, oh boy, when Near Israel in 52 made a formal deal with Loyola, the very beginnings of those, the idea being like this, you get, well, it's a pragmatic, see? The idea is like this. They can go to Loyola and they've got 30 credits that they don't have to take, because he's studying yeshiva. So in other words, that boils down to, instead of taking 4 years of courses, he takes 3 years of courses. Oh my goodness. I don't know who was alive at that time. I don't think anybody's alive. And I'm not going to go through all the Lashon Hara. All hell broke loose. And Rabbi Rudim had a tough time defending it. And I'm making a point, because before Rabbi Aharon Kotler came here, the whole question wouldn't have been up for even for discussion. You see? People would have said, oh, very good. Not only go to college, you also go to yeshiva. Now he said, I guess you go to yeshiva. How dare you go to college? In the formal way that I just described. Okay? One thing Rabbi Aharon did during his time here was he radiated so much authority that he was able to make the other Rosh Yeshivas attain charismatic status. Because this is something that didn't exist before, but sure did afterwards. So as a result of his time, people like Rabbi Ruderman, or the heads of Telz, or of Tarvadas, or of Chaim Berlin, or RJJ, whatever the yeshivas were, all of a sudden became powerful status figures. You get what I'm saying? Rabbi Ruderman became a big deal after Rabbi Aharon showed up, not before. And that's true with the others as well. This is leadership. And this is very powerful, charismatic leadership. As a matter of fact, as a result of what I'm talking about, the rabbinate became nothing and the Rosh Yeshiva became everything. When I was young, and maybe you, the pulpit rabbinate had no authority. You understand? He's a nice guy, he's a shul, this, that, and the other. That's not who you went to find out what Yiddishkeit is about. Because the pulpit rabbinate was seen as having sold out most of the time, not every time, but I'm talking about most of the time. Because people didn't keep Shabbos, they drive the shul, they didn't keep all the things we refer to as decadent orthodoxy of yesteryear, which was everywhere, okay? So that robbed the pulpit rabbinate of its authority. The old guys from the Agudas Rabbanim were also lost all their authority. And if a Rosh Yeshiva said it, that's a big deal. That became the source of authority, okay? So if you wanted to get really backing, you had to get the yeshiva. The synagogue became nothing, and the yeshiva became everything. Because by and large, with rare exceptions, the yeshiva was the only place where Judaism was taken seriously and practiced seriously. The synagogue was the place where, as Chaim Soloveitchik says, the president of his father's shul bent down and the money came out on Yom Kippur. You understand? But this wouldn't happen in a yeshiva. So, in other words, if you're a young boy growing up, I'm trying to give you an idea of what the French call mentalité. If you take Judaism seriously, you don't have to, but if you do, you say like this: I don't see Judaism taken seriously, where my old man davens and that kind of stuff, where my grandfather davens. But over here, in Tarvadas, or near Israel, or this, there it's taken very seriously. So if I'm going to take it seriously, that's where I'm going. You see? If I'm not taking it seriously, I don't go anywhere. Okay? If I don't take it seriously, I'm not going to end up in the synagogue either. Now, of course, there are reasons for this, but this is what happened. I mean, basically, the synagogues had compromised and the yeshivas had not. The synagogues were bastions of decadence, Now, decadence in the sense of Torah mitzvahs, Now, so in the decades of the 40s and 50s, Rabbi Aharon Kotler created a new countercultural reality, symbolized, as I would say, in the married couple that does not go to college, and he learns and she works. So you can't get more anti-American, especially in the 40s and 50s and 60s, right? In other words, this is not Ozzie and Harriet. That's not the way it's supposed to go. You see? And here's one guy that just pushed it through, as we know. He pushed it through. Now, so powerful was the dynamism of his right-wing influence, we can see in hindsight today, that it clashed and badly damaged modern orthodoxy in its various iterations. Because, like YU, they had been their development in the 20s and 30s and 40s, and by the 40s and 50s, they already had what I would call a whole cadre, like Rabbi Rackman and people like that, who had designs that orthodoxy should evolve in this way. And this Lakewood, as I call it, hit them like a storm. You see? Instead of modern orthodoxy becoming central, it was marginalized to its chagrin and disappointment. So if you would have asked Norman Lamb or something like 1950, said, what's the future going to be? Oh, the future is going to be like this. It didn't turn out that way. Okay? And it makes no sense, because what we're doing is logical and normal and culturally open, and this thing is the opposite. This should be marginalized, and we should be, but it didn't turn out that way. That's what I'm telling you. The history is a fascinating one. Okay? Now, part of this has to do with the personality and leadership style, or maybe lack thereof, on the part of Rabbi Soloveitchik, who did not choose to adhere to the new model, but in other words, he didn't set up his own yeshiva and become a dynamically, rather he taught it like you. And he always said, you guys can make, he told us the Talmudim, he said, this is my opinion, you can make your opinion up, all the rest of it. He preferred to remain in the interwar model. I would say Rabbi Soloveitchik, who was a going out there, bigger than the others in learning, but he's in the 20s and 30s style. Americanize, but keep the Yiddishkeit. Right? Americanize, but you should keep the Yiddishkeit. Now, and of course he had this so in other words, he didn't emerge, maybe I'm sure to the disappointment of his followers, as a Rabbi Aharon Kotler, fireball style. And as we know, he had a very, let's go to the next one. He had a very complicated relationship with Rabbi Aharon Kotler and the whole yeshiva world. As this is a famous picture where he supports the Chinuch Atzmai. But in the middle 50s, he joined the Mizrahi, because he wasn't a member till in the middle 50s. And he's making his own statement. But he didn't then charge around and say like this, let's go around to all the yeshivas and get all the boys joining the Mizrahi. He didn't have this, like I say, locomotive leadership style. It's very complicated, but we all know what happened. As a result, when you talk about the decades I'm referring to, YU and modern Orthodoxy became marginalized to an important extent. Although at the time, Norman Lim, I remember this, he predicted that the new Haredism would prove to be a marginal phenomenon. He was wrong. And he wrote, because one of the reasons they started the tradition in the late 50s was to give voice, what they thought would be a leadership role in the whole American Jewry. And he said at that time, very famously, he said, Ron Kotler knows Tosa better than me, but I know the American Jew better than him. Well, not really. I mean, he knew the Upper West Side. You get it, He knew that. But if you're talking about broadly across America, the hearts and minds, as we call it, after Vietnam, these kind of things didn't go that direction, which is, interesting, but that's what happened. Okay. I'm stressing Rabbi Aharon Kotler over here because he brought a new type of charisma to America, combined with an active personality that made many Jews say, this is the path to follow because he's the real thing. But Rabbi Aharon died rather young. He was only here 20 years, and he died at the age of 71. Right? So you could definitely imagine him living another 10, 15 years, right? Without question. And he didn't leave a successor. There's no Rabbi Aharon Kotlers after him. He was the one that was tight. The other Rosh Hashivas were great in learning. They had the learning charisma, and they were Europeans, so they were like They had the charisma of having, been in Europe and learned by the Gedolim and all that stuff. But they were not fiery activists the way Rabbi Aharon was. Their nature was not as radical. If you want to do a great paper, what had Rabbi Aharon Kotler done with the hippie, with the 60s? He died in 62, just at the beginning. That would have been interesting, okay? Because you would find one radical in the company of other radicals. You get it? The radicalism would be the same, just in a different direction. But what would you have done with that? Now, on the contrary, the other Rosh Hashivas who survived, now I'm talking about the 60s and the 70s now, and the 80s, were quite cautious and conservative by nature. If you think about those years, I think you'll see what I mean. And over the next 25 years, they contented themselves with following the path laid down by Rabbi Aharon and consolidating it. So in other words, an entire subculture was then created and consolidated, and that subculture is here today. Now, the charisma of, let's say, for example, Moshe Feinstein was pretty potent, but he's not Rabbi Aharon. Okay? Moshe Feinstein is famous as halachic authority. His halachic rulings were socially unassailable, by which I mean, this is a great sefer, a really nice sefer that came out a couple years ago, in which this fellow, I think from YU or maybe from Staten Island, collected all the criticisms on the Igros Moshe. I mean this in a scholarly sense. You know what I'm saying? In other words, Moshe paskent this, he paskent that, and this one disagreed with him for this reason, that one disagreed for that reason, which is what happens when you publish scholarship. And Moshe Feinstein issued a lot of, I'd say, controversial rulings. Probably most of you don't know what I'm talking about. And I'm not referring to the ones you think of, just in a lot of areas, in Hilchos Shabbos, Hilchos this, Hilchos that. It don't matter. A book like this could never have come out at that time and gotten any traction. Because I think many of us are old enough to remember, when he was there, if he said this, then that's it. The public isn't in the league of saying, well, how can you say this? The Tosa said this over here. Or what kind of a svara is this, all the rest of it. That's not for 99%. You get it? And so maybe this one said, what's he talking about? The whole world followed this. The shul I'm standing in right now, Shem Remuna, I'm old enough to remember the very beginnings of it, more than probably anybody here, I imagine, more than anyone here. And I remember when they started, before they had the building, in the time of Rabbi Bach, they put in the Constitution, maybe it's still there, he said this shul is going to follow the rulings of Moshe Feinstein, back in 1970 or thereabouts. It's in the original Constitution. Because there were questions of microphone and a mechitza and this and that and the other, they didn't want any kind of, issues, because what used to happen in America in the modern Orthodox shuls, I don't mean modern Orthodox like today, but the decadent shuls of yesteryear, were dozens of synagogues in the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s, as Rabbi Oberstein mentioned before, switched to conservative. Dozens, maybe more than dozens, all over the country. And what happens, just interesting, and what happened very often was you'd have, let's say, 2/3 and 1/3, or 3/4 and 1/4. So the small minority wanted the shul to stay Orthodox. And they would say, well, take it to court. And it would say, it says in the Constitution it's Orthodox. And then they would bring in Rabbi Agus from the conservative, or this, that, and the other, and they say, this is Orthodox. Conservative Jews is Orthodox. Show me in the Shulchan Aruch where it says you have to have mechitza. Show me in the Shulchan Aruch where it says you can't have a microphone. At which point the judge, who's not Jewish, I guess, I can't get in this level. You know what I mean? Mind you, Rabbi Soloveitchik used to come and testify it happened in New Orleans, it happened in, many of us remember, in Michigan, all over the country. And, courts can't get into that, right? The courts don't want to deal with that. And so, in order to get around that business, to the Shomrei, they say like this shul is Orthodox according to Moshe Feinstein. You follow? But I'm simply making a point about charisma, right? The people I'm talking about, these Russia, were approached with awe, right? But the very fact that as late as 1970 or thereabouts, you have a shul, like we're starting in now, a Shomrei, that's a harbinger, because 50 years now, isn't it? Can you imagine Shomrei's 50 years old or more? As one of the first of many. The new trend, which is, if I can use the term, the frum shul, right? Which didn't exist so often long ago. It didn't exist so often long ago. When I was a kid, you had 1 or 2 shuls like that altogether. You had dozens of Orthodox shuls, but you didn't have frum shuls. Okay? And Jewry wasn't a bunch of old timers and all the rest, of a bunch of American guys. From YU, from there, and from everywhere. So what am I talking about? It's this charisma that I'm referring to. Okay? Now, because the other shuls I spoke about before have died. The only one left I know is Betavilla. So during the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, these Gedolim provided the legitimacy. And they did so with efficient effectiveness to once again frustrate the growth of a modern Orthodoxy as a big movement in America. These trends, of course, as you and I know, were aided and strengthened, at least comes to mind, 2 notable phenomena. One is that all of a sudden everybody started going to Israeli yeshivas after the 6-Day War. That's big. So every kid, boy and girl, eventually goes to yeshiva to get frummed out or flipped or whatever you want to call it. And so it's, let me put it this way. For the great majority, the year or two that you go in yeshiva in Israel is a right-wing experience, not a left-wing experience. That's my point. That doesn't mean you're going to come out that way, whatever, but it's a right-ish experience rather than a left-ish experience. That's number one. And number two, you also had here, at the same time that I'm talking about, because I've been speaking about Aharon Kotler and the yeshivas, all the rest of it, that's not the only game in town. You also had, at the same time, in the same decades, the innovation here in America of something unprecedented, which was big Hasidic, charismatic rabbis of world-class level, which never existed before in America. And they were here in the same period, at the 40s to the 80s to the 90s. That's that generation. So when I say Gedolim, it's not just a non-Hasidic, it's the Hasidic, which is big, okay, in their way. All right? So, for example, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and I'm talking about the last one, because he was from 1950 to 1993, so it's basically the same era, was exactly the same kind of strongly active countercultural leader as Rabbi Aharon Kotler. Of course, mutatis mutandis, as we say. You have to adjust it for the Hasidic and the Chabad part. But there's no question, if you're a Lubavitch Chassid or a sympathizer, he laid a path. And this is the way you go. And to be a shliach, for example, is not an American institution. Right? It's not one that says you go to high school, you go to college, you settle down, you raise a family. He was all against the bourgeois approach. If you ever heard his speeches, he said, when you're dead, you get to sleep. Meanwhile, is active. And I don't want to hear you have a problem going to, the Belgian Congo or Argentina or this, that, and the other. Go. Or go be a shliach on college campus or something like that. That's a strong leadership. Now, you either turn on or you turn off. But as we know, a ton of people turn on. This is going simultaneously with everything I said before. So I'm trying to convey to you tonight what I regard as the historical point that the 4 or 5 decades of the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s were a most unusual period in American history, although I don't believe most American Jews realized it, and I don't think Orthodox Jews put it in the framework that I'm trying to lay it historically tonight. Lubavitch, to his Hasidim, is unbelievably charismatic and authoritative. And although he was more au courant with modernity, because Rabbi Aharon Kotler would reject modernity, and the Lubavitch Rebbe knew science and this and that and culture, and so because he made it his business to do so, but it's not a model he instructed the mass of his followers to follow. I still remember when I was a kid, my father used to get Hadoar. Do anybody remember that? Hadoar was a Hebrew magazine. And he was speaking, and I was much younger. And they had so it was a secular magazine, but they had an interview with the Lubavitch Rebbe. And at that time, and they said like this, what about college? I'm against college. You went to college? He said like this, just because I remember that, just because I jumped off the 3rd floor and didn't break my leg, I'm not telling somebody else to do that. You see, it's attitude. It's attitude, okay? Now my point is, there never was a Rebbe like that in America before, and there hasn't been one since he passed away, because he left no successor. When you factor in that Chabad, under his direction, went into the Jewish missionary business and has set up operations in all 50 states now, so that today Chabad has a following even among non-Orthodox Jews. And all the shlichim are inspired by his charisma. You see the importance of those 4 decades of Gedolim, of the personal example. Notice, he spark plugged a heck of a lot of people. Now, you can be Lubavitch, you can like Lubavitch, you can hate Lubavitch. I'm speaking over here, it's a historic fact. Okay? I mentioned my show this morning, perhaps you saw the article, I don't know if you did or not, online, where there's a huge wave of resignations and open pulpits in the conservative reform movement, because a lot of people are retired, plus a lot of the young ones are resigning. And if I'm going by memory, you can look it up yourself now. It's in the JTA. And they said something to the effect that the conservative headquarters send out the following message. In the next year, it's going to be 150 or 160 empty pulpits. And we only have at most 80 people to fill them. So get used to the fact that a lot of you are not going to have rabbis. And I said for a joke, but it's not a joke. I said, Lubavitch, I guess, we'll send them. No problem. Right? No problem. Incidentally, it's a very interesting article because if somebody's old and retires, that's one thing. But a lot of young people, this is what the article said, young conservative rabbis, young reform rabbis, young reconstruction rabbis are quitting. And I'm paraphrasing, I'm quoting, and they said, why? It's soul crushing and depression that there's nobody in shul. You prepare a big speech, you have a cantor, you have a choir, you have even an orchestra and all the rest of it, and it's 5-10 people. You know, it gets to you. Anyhow, my point is that Chabad is another factor in the right-wing trend and historically coincided the same decades. So in other words, the Lubavitch and all of its movement was not in the direction of modern Orthodoxy. Okay? And thirdly, you have Satmar, which you probably don't know is the largest group. If you look at the numbers in the world today, this is as best as I can put it together. There are 800,000 Hasidim altogether, and 100,000 are Satmar. Much bigger than any other group, for understandable reasons. But nevertheless, it's a big thing. Now, see, because they're by themselves, so you say, well, you don't see it, but they're here. Okay? They're part of the story of American Jewry in the second half of the 20th century and first part of the 21st century. And they're growing faster than anyone else. They're growing faster than anyone else. There certainly was nobody like the Satmar Rebbe before he came here after the Second World War. That's for sure. You cannot get more countercultural. You can't get a more intense leadership style. If you read his biographies, he even designed the lady stockings. You know what I mean? No, it's down to everything, what everybody should wear from A to Z. And his followers go with that. That's how you define yourself. And it's the largest Hasidic group. And it's taking place in the United States of America. I would even point out it's taking place in Manhattan and Brooklyn. Notice, in the cultural epicenter of modernity in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and so forth. So a few blocks away from where they live is the most remarkable cultural stuff going on. And Satmar just, they grow, they do their thing. Okay? Remember, if you're a polarizing leader, you get half. If you take a very strong position that turns some people off, it also turns some people on. His charisma created the Satmar Hasidim in New York. I don't know if you know this or not. The Satmar Hasidim, that's a new thing. The ones in Europe got killed mostly. They're gone. He got out, but they didn't. They got killed. The Satmar Hasidus that built them in New York, which is gigantic, means people from other places in Hungary, who when they came to America said, this is the team I'm joining. They met him from this place, and that place. And they did so because of his unique charismatic leadership, if that's the style that appeals to you. Okay? It's the same decades. It's the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and so forth. But all these Gedolim died in the years 1979 to 1993, I believe. And their successors were not them. The successors would be the first to admit it. I can't imagine Rosh Hashiva today who say, I'll make Rabbi Aharon Kotler. It's no insult to say to Rabbi Feldman, there is always, I'm not Rabbi Ruderman. You see? The successor of Moshe Feinstein, we're not like him. That's just what it is, okay? They wouldn't challenge that. Even if you're a good at today, it ain't the same thing. Before you put this up, put that down. Tell me, no. I'm not going to do this, but I'm asking rhetorically. Who's on the Moetzes Gedolim Torah today? Moshe Feinstein's dead, by the way. Huh? Yeah, no, you can say one or two. Rabbi Aharon Feldman, there's no question about it. You get what I'm saying? Most people have no idea, nor will they know all the names. Now you can show it. That's good, right? I mean, do you know all these names? And second of all, did you know that they were in the Moetzes? Okay? I'd be surprised because 6 of them were added very recently. Right? You see my point. Okay? Now, when I was young, you were young, you recognized those names. There's a Moshe Feinstein, there's a Rabbi Hutner, there's a Rabbi Ruderman, and so on and so forth. You see what I'm saying? So this is what we call routinized charisma. You get it? It's not the original charisma, it's routinized charisma. In other words, you're taking, in Moetzes Gedolim Torah, it's a high office, or it aspires to be. But it used to be Reb Chaim Moshe Grushinsky and the Chofetz Chaim and people like that, and then this and this. It's a different thing. They will be the first to admit it, right? Rabbi Aharon Kotler is not going to say, I'm the same thing as Rabbi Aharon Kotler, right? Not going to say it. So, here, let's go to the next one. A year ago or so is when they added 6 new names. I don't think people noticed it. Now, so the question is, starting from 1988 to 1992, which was really what I should be concentrating on tonight, but I can cheat. The big question, in other words, when these people passed away, was how would a phenomenon which had run on the unique Judaic charisma of the personal chemistry of a group of remarkable people, how would this phenomenon fare once these people were removed from the scene? This was, in other words, a new era, a new phase of American Jewish history. It's so recent, most of us probably don't think of it from that angle at all. You and I are living in the era post-Gedolim, in the sense that I've described today. How was Orthodox Judaism, and how has Orthodox Judaism and Orthodox Jewry fared, let's say, in the last 30, 40 years? That is the question we're asking. The first answer is that the education networks have continued to function and have even grown, graduating ever increasing numbers of boys and girls. This itself is a sociological revolution new to America. So in other words, in our lifetime, most of us, we have now masses of young people who have gone through day schools and yeshiva system, which you never had before. I mean, masses, okay? That's a game changer, right? I'm not going to do like Rabbi Oberson and say, well, when we were young, there was a very small number, but it's true. Right? It's true. He's not wrong. You see? And today is just a new reality. That's number one. Now, this is a function of institutionalization and even of bureaucracy. If you have a numerically large constituency, I guess you don't need personal charisma. Maybe. Second of all, there is living memory of the personal chemistry, but that's a one-generation phenomenon. So, for me and many of you, we remember this famous gadol, that famous gadol. If you're an older Chabadnik, you remember physically the Rebbe and that sort of thing. But the children, the grandchildren, after all, you don't remember it. Okay, it's a one-generation phenomenon. That's always how it goes in history. I mean, literally, whenever you've had Gedolim down the generations, if they were the big type, in their time, they were just seen beyond. So you couldn't imagine if you were a student of Rabbi Akiva Eger, for example, did anyone ever challenge anything he said. But give it 50, 60 years, and when it's in receding in history, and somebody will say, I have a kasha on Rabbi Akiva Eger. You understand? Or the Noda B'Yehuda, wherever it is. That's always how it goes. And then, of course, there's learning itself. I'm talking about Gemara learning, which has significantly increased in this post-Gadol period, in our lifetime. In the art scroll, the Steinsalz, the Mesivta, and all these other things, which has bridged the gap and simplified learning, and that itself is an intellectual / sociological revolution. You can't deny it. So now you got Daf Yomi in an unprecedented way, physical as well as online in 100 other ways. You got your Dear Shoe, and I don't know all the other programs. There's a ton of them out there. Can't yearbook. And that just means that there's numerically a lot more learning going on than a few guys in the shul where the rabbi, the shamus, is giving a shiur as in the old days in Yiddish. That's not the model anymore. Okay? That's why I try to explain to my college students, it just is a chasm, which is growing wider all the time, between the two segments of American Jewry. Right? This is becoming more this, and that's becoming more that, you see. Now, as I said before, the yeshivas, the Beis Yaakovs, and the kollels continue to function, producing a mass of Torah literate types on an unprecedented scale in American history. And so a lot more, you just physically have a lot more Maggid Shir types, including businessmen. We have no trouble filling the Daf Yomi ranks, so to speak, of Maggid Shirs. You know, you could ship them out of Lakewood and cover the whole country, for example. This is not a small development in U.S. history. You never had a mass of American-born people here who are serious learners. The studying in Israeli yeshivas and seminaries has continued to play a big role in right-wing trending. In fact, ever more so. Don't you agree? Ever more so. At the same time, interestingly, after the Gedolim, after they were gone, in the post-Gedolim period, has come the Touro College came of age. Now I'm not referring specifically to Touro College, but that model. Okay? In other words, college programs in the context of Torah Parnasa and the American Haredi world. For the girls and the boys. Is this not true? I don't even know. My kids are great children. You know, they're doing this program, this is online. You get credits for this, you do that and the other. It's a real degree, and then you take your graduate program, whatever it is. And at the end of the day, it's not a liberal arts education. It's not a classic college education like I got it. You got perhaps. It's a different model. But what's happened is a formal post-high school education system. And as far as I can tell, it's even in Lakewood. You know? Which is probably Aharon Kotler's like saying, what the heck happened over here? You get it? But again, it's within the context, I said before, not of Torah Mada or Torah Parnaso, which is a different thing. I don't know how this is going to work out, but this is the way it's turned out. So my point is like this: Ner Israel is not unique today at all. You know, not controversial at all. Now, personally, in my opinion, Rabbi Aharon Kotler would have preferred what we call the nouveau riche. You know, the young guys that don't go to college and make it big in business. That'd be more like his model, you know, of which there are a lot. The developments of modern Orthodoxy have been tense and interesting. Here, too, there emerged no replacement for Rav Soloveitchik. And I'll say it again. Rav Rosh Hashanah will be the first one to say that. You understand? And in his absence, as we know, and he passed away, in the late 80s, I guess? Early 90s. But he was already in bad shape. So, what do you call it? In that time, modern Orthodoxy had broken into two paths. Personified by Rabbi Schechter on the one hand. Well, they're both students of Rabbi Soloveitchik, and they both claim to represent his legacy, as we all know very well. And, you know, I do a fair amount of speaking around the country, and you see, there's this type of shul and there's that type of shul. You understand? So there's been like a fork in the road. The establishment, in fact, of open Orthodoxy as a distinct separate organization and movement reflects clearly a leftist frustration with changing YU and overcoming what I would call the Herschel Schachter types and their influence. That's why Rabbi Weiss started his own school, right? In other words, he's like, why he's incorrigible? You know, it's not going to work. Open Orthodoxy would never have happened, I think, in the period of the personal chemistry I was talking about before, where Soloveitchik was alive, where Moshe Feinstein and the other ones were alive. This would have stamped it with a strong delegitimation. But in the absence of such people, there's nobody, they feel, that can give it that kind of delegitimation, so we're going to do it. One fascinating development in modern Orthodoxy, I spoke about this in my show last week, which is funny, is Neo-Hasidism, which has to do with a quest for spirituality as opposed to boring religious practices and rules. I knew I should have brought something with me tonight. This is Jewish Review of Books, and you can get it if you're in college or you can order online. And there's a very interesting article by Shai Secunda, who was in Israel, was a student of mine long ago, but he's became a big professor, on the phenomenon of neo-Hasidism in the modern Orthodox world. Now, neo-Hasidism as opposed to Hasidism is a funny term, and I learned a lot from looking at this article. And I'll tell you what I mean. Neo-Hasidism is a term we use in academia for non-Orthodox Jews who want to appropriate bits and pieces of Hasidism to enhance their reform, their conservative reconstruction, and all that kind of stuff. Like Martin Buber, for example, and Heschel, and Gershom Scholem, and people like that, who weren't interested in being from at all. But on the other hand, they argued that there are elements from within Hasidism. And you can agree or disagree with them. I'm just saying what happened. There are elements within Hasidism that are useful and good, and they help others. Of course, we don't want all the bad Hasidic stuff, but we want the good pieces. So whenever you use the term neo-Hasidim, it always says not from. Okay, it's not from. But now it turns out, again, this Rabbi Weinberger, and he had Joey Rosenfeld. I learned a whole bunch of names I never knew existed from reading this piece. And there are a lot of people that have very popular either podcasts, or they go around speaking, or they have big followings, or it's online, or this, that, and the other. And basically, they are responding to a thirst for spirituality, which is not necessarily what you get in Orthodox Judaism, which is interesting what I just said. You can get Gemara learning, you can get halachic practice, you can get, this, that, and the other. You really can. And maybe you can get spirituality, and maybe not. Maybe the davening turns you on, maybe it doesn't work for you. Maybe you connected with a Rebbe or something along the way, or a Morah or a teacher, or maybe you did not. And the point he was making in the article was these guys are going all over Teaneck and Englewood and all the other places you wouldn't have imagined. It's not Torah Mata. Now, by the way, some of them have graduated from YU, but they're not Torah Mata, because that's not what people are interested in, which I thought was interesting. Intellectual synthesis and all the rest of it doesn't necessarily mean that much to me if I'm a successful lawyer on Wall Street. The only thing is I live in Teaneck, so what does my fact that I work successfully in the law world of Wall Street have to do with the idea that I want to somehow synthesize Maimonides and Kant? It doesn't necessarily, but what this guy says, if they have a kumsitz and they have the singing and all this other kind of stuff, it was funny to me, but it was revelatory. So if you're interested at all, you'll go and look up this article. Which means we shouldn't be surprised, because it's 2022. It's not 1922. It's not 1982. Many of us, I think, we're all going to be incorrigible on this. We grew up in the 20th century. We can't help it. We grew up in the 20th century. And people who live in the 20th century can't help but think the 21st century is going to be like the same thing. But from history, it's never like that. The 18th century really was different than the 17th. And the 19th century was different. And the young people growing up in the 21st century are not having the same issues that may have interested us once upon a time long ago. And you can get angry over it, and I get angry, but it's just it. So these seem to be, mega trends, which are interesting. Now, in my opinion, when we were growing up, the personal chemistry, of these Gedolim, they supplied a lot of spirituality. It was after the Holocaust, and you saw the people, and they were very, had the aura and things like that. But you don't have this anymore. You don't have it anymore. This vacuum of spirituality and the popularity of neo-Hasidic responses is a right-wing and not a left-wing trend. I want to emphasize that. That's the interesting part about this. These are people talking about morale, Rav Kook, Breslov, Zohar, I don't know what, Not the other way. You see, it's responding to a different thing. People are seeking to appropriate Ruchnius elements from classical sources, not Gemara, but classical sources, like I mentioned before, the Pachad Yitzchak, whatever, to enhance their Judaism. They're not looking for a transvaluation of values like open orthodoxy, in which you want to say that we should accommodate ourselves to the values we find, whether political, sexual, or anything else of the 21st century. It's a different agenda. For its part, The Open Orthodox movement has started its own rabbinical schools. It's ordained women. It's fostered by biblical criticism. And in general, seeking to change Orthodoxy altogether, modern Orthodoxy in the short run, general Orthodoxy in the long run. Is it going anywhere? We don't know. I mean, it's 2022. It's too early to tell. There's been a modern Orthodox movement of intellectuality that's in Torah Mata, but to the degree it challenged fundamentalism, it got slammed along the way. That's what happened with Slifkin, as far as I can see. You understand? When it challenged the fundamentalism, it got slammed. So again, you can say it's good, you can say a bit. I'm just trying to call your attention to the megatrends. The Open Orthodoxy seems to be marginalized, and others seek to brand it as conservative. It's like a new form of conservative Judaism, which is a loser label these days, because conservative Judaism is going down the tubes. But of course, Open Orthodoxy stoutly denies this. So where are things heading? The other area of intellectuality, it seems to me, is the interest in Jewish history. Or what are we doing here tonight? I'm talking about academic Jewish history. This is something new in Orthodoxy. There's something, and I'm not the only one. It's hard to tell where this may lead. It could lead in a challenging direction, it could lead in a reinforcing direction. Finally, the period after the Gedolim has seen a revolutionary technology that they didn't face and that can change everything, and that's the internet. It is a new reality. Rabbi Aharon Kotler couldn't imagine the internet, okay? Now, of course, the internet can do a lot of good, but I'm not talking about that part. Okay? They used to be afraid of college, the Gedolim, because of the ideas exposed students to. Well, guess what? With the internet, you press a button, you got everything. You see? Will this turn increasing numbers into unbelievers? And I see that, by the way. You're not me. I interact with different students in different places, different times. And, there are a number of people who, as a result of the internet, it's given up on Olam Emunah. That's fact. The hour is late, so we'll explore this next year. Good night.